Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, November 13th. November 13th, that was the day that Felix Unger was asked to remove himself from his place of residence. That request came from his wife. Yes, it is Odd Couple Day. Happy Odd Couple Day to all who observe. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
So the story of the week that we have not gotten to is not just the week, but the month, the year, perhaps the century, is the approximate thing we need to discuss is what happened in Amsterdam last Thursday night, the actual first pogrom that we have seen in my lifetime, visible evidence of a actual urban incident in which gangs of people were hunting down Jewish people in the streets of Amsterdam. And this is a major event, not only in itself, because as we have all year, seen things that we had not thought we would see again in our lifetimes, certainly maybe not in Europe, after what happened in Europe 80 years ago. But as it was happening in Amsterdam, we had numerous incidents in the United States in the last 8 or 9 days, all of which have a quality of hunting not dissimilar to the fact that the Amsterdam pogrom was called a Jew hunt in the WhatsApp group messages that were being shared by those who participated in it and who apparently organized themselves through Uber and other transportation apps, detailing where people were, where they were going, where you could find groups of Jews leaving the soccer stadium, what subway lines they were taking, what hotels they were staying in. And this, again, was called a Jew hunt. In Chicago, of course, we had a illegal immigrant from Mauritania hunting down a Sabbath synagogue goer, shooting him while yelling Allahu Akbar. A little boy in Brooklyn, you've probably seen the footage, walking down the street again on Shabbat with his father and being pulled away, lifted up off the ground physically by a masked man. The father quickly pulls the kid back to him. Another kid riding a bicycle, again in Brooklyn, slapped off his bicycle by a man standing nearby. Two guys on the in front of the DePaul University Student Center in Chicago being tackled out of nowhere. One of them wearing a shirt that says, I'm an Israeli war veteran, ask me anything. And so the randomness of those things, which is the way you hunt people in the United States, because what frightens people in a country this large is random assaults, like random attacks have this quality of this unnerving quality. A place like Amsterdam, you would do it in groups because that's a sort of a smaller, more homogeneous place, easier to target.
Also, can I add, John, that in a place like Amsterdam, there's a community that's with you on this hunt. It's a different demographic reality there.
Yeah. So Dan Senor had Ayan Hirsi Ali on his podcast to talk about this, which of course was very interesting. Ayan, who was written for commentary, was a legislator in the Dutch parliament, herself a refugee from fundamentalist Islam in Somalia, comes to Holland to save herself, goes to the University of Leiden, gets a PhD, goes to work for a think tank, becomes a legislator. And because she was under such threat, because she would speak honestly about the threat of radical Islam, was under police guard. This is in the early part of the 21st century, in the first years of the 21st century. And then inexplicably, out of nowhere, the Dutch government sort of announced it would no longer protect her. No
Well,
longer.
not inexplicably. Several prominent political figures and artists were murdered. She was next on a list, right, including her name was on a list, yeah, and they withdrew. They basically were threatening on a technicality that was clearly drummed up, threatening to revoke her citizenship because of what they claimed was a technicality on her application.
Yes, right. Yes,
and she,
after, right.
Yes, and she had
after
to
the
flee.
Murder of Theo Van Gogh,
exactly,
who was a filmmaker, and then a parliamentarian. Anyway, who were speaking out against radical Islam, open Muslim immigration to the Netherlands, and of course she then has moved to the United States. And
can I just add, when she came to the U.S. and was looking for an institution, there was one institution in Washington that took her in, even with all of the security challenges, and that was the American Enterprise Institute. She came to AEI and was there and did excellent work there for a while before she moved to the West Coast. And we were very grateful to have her. And, there were lots of institutions in Washington that didn't want someone that came with the threats against her, or quite frankly, what she stood for in speaking.
So on the podcast, Ion basically said, well, these are what we saw here was the chickens coming home to roost that we saw in chrysalis, or that she experienced in chrysalis form, that you create this ideology, this kind of pan-nationalist ideology, which is what she referred to in the piece she wrote for us called "The Tragedy of Mr. Consensus." And that over time, you then create, as our old friend Noah Rothman would have said on this podcast, the permission structure that leads inevitably to something like what happened at the soccer stadium, including the fact that there was some evidence that the authorities in the Netherlands knew or monitoring or had some advance notice that trouble was in the offing, and deliberately, apparently, did not move to preposition assets and forces except directly outside the stadium to guide people out of the immediate perimeter of the stadium, then stopping at some point and saying, this is as far as we go, you can go into the metro by yourself. So they knew
telling fans not to take taxis.
And they told fans not to take taxis. Exactly.
Yeah, so they knew what was coming.
They
said,
knew,
don't get
and they
didn't
want to. And the policy of the city of Amsterdam and the government of the Netherlands is to de-escalate or not to engage, or some version of that. Or they didn't even necessarily have confidence that the police force wouldn't somehow side with the protesters. Something like that. So I have a piece in the new issue of Commentary, which will be available today. A couple of pieces in the issue, but our ed letter, the ed letter, which I write, the opening page in the magazine, echoed very much by Bret Stevens's superb column today in the New York Times, which is about why this is happening and how this has happened. And this is what the Jew hunt is on. Is my point that we kept thinking last year, how can this get worse? How can things get worse than the campus scenes or the marches or whatever? And how it can get worse is that individual Jews at random are being targeted for violent assault. And
it's ironic
what happens now
that as Israel is winning its fight in Gaza, pursuing its objective of uprooting Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon, showing Iran that Iran's air defense systems no longer exist, and Israeli pilots can travel across the region and be home for breakfast, directed by female navigators. As Israel's security situation is improving, the state of the diaspora is declining. And this is the next front in the conflict, is protecting Jews worldwide. As Abe said earlier this week, this is what globalized, the intifada, means. And so we have to take every measure now, while supporting Israel, also recognizing this threat to Jews around the world.
Can I add an incident to that list? Also, there was a few days ago, a Maccabi youth soccer team, which is 17 and under, in Berlin, was spat on during a match in a apparently it's a Turkish Muslim neighborhood. And after the game, were chased home. People came with knives and sticks and helped chase the teenage soccer players home. Now, Maccabi Berlin, this is the Maccabi sports structure in Germany was, founded basically at the turn of the 20th century so that Jews could have a place to play and to work out and all this other stuff. And also it was more egalitarian than others, the main gymnasium groups or whatever in Germany, the non-sectarian ones didn't allow women to vote and all sorts of stuff on that. And the Jewish one was very egalitarian. And so they had these clubs and they were slowly whittled away in Germany by threats, by attacks, and then eventually by law, and were closed down. And Maccabi Berlin is the legacy organization that was re-established about 20 years or so after the Holocaust, when there was a moment to reestablish Jewish cultural life in Germany. So there's a lot of symbolism around the specific targets, and also what's happening is, we say this all the time, we talk about historical echoes, but a Maccabi Berlin sports team being chased with sticks and knives is like the original echo.
And of course, what you have here is an imported population, right? The story of Nazi Germany and the final solution and the war against the Jews is that it was an indigenous German cultural outgrowth of indigenous German culture and the growth of these ideas over a century. And because of ruinous and destructive ideas about immigration and the idea that you could simply wholesale allow into Europe millions upon millions upon millions of people for understandably humanitarian reasons, who had absolutely no connection to Western ideas about coexistence and rule of law and a liberal understanding of the integration of minority populations into a majority, respecting each other's minority status and all of that. And now, so they essentially imported final solution thinking through mass immigration.
But it's a little more complicated than that, I think. I mean, in Germany in particular, Turkish migration has been going on for many this is a multi-generational German population now. What's worth exploring is why and how it has become so radicalized to violence in recent memory, because some of these young men, chasing Jews down the street are probably third or fourth generation German now. I mean, these are people whose parents and grandparents came in the 20th century. And so they are German. There's a very large Turkish population, but the radicalization, and I think Ayan and others who saw this very early on in parts of Europe have spoken to this. It does kind of go hand in hand with what Abe was saying, a kind of intellectual movement that started, which people thought wouldn't lead to action, about globalized the intifada, about all these sort of this idea of Israel as this threat somehow to the rest of the world. And that has taken hold, and it has been taught over and over again for several generations. And now the violence, we see the violence, which is the logical conclusion of that message.
I mean, the idea of globalizing the intifada had come to Islamist thinkers and leaders decades before it came to American campuses. And this is the fruit of a plan to radicalize in Western countries. Much easier to do in Europe, also because European countries, the fabric that sort of holds them together is different in many respects than it is from the fabric here, which is so intimately tied with our ideals and notions of individual liberty and state.
No, that's absolutely true. I should mention, following Christine's point about the Turkish populations in Germany and elsewhere, and of course, this is true in Britain also, which it's not Turkish. Like there is a South Asian, Pakistani population, and Indian population within the Commonwealth, or some version of the old British Empire, that also 2 or 3, 4 generations in London and in Britain that has gotten radicalized over the past 25, 30 years in particular. And part of the radicalization is there's a kind of bifurcated ideological cause of it. On the one hand, you have a lot of this population coming into these cities, including Paris and others, to be a cheap workforce. And they are not integrated. The blood and soil of Europe, where you can't really become French, right, does leave these populations who live in the banlieue outside Paris, or in Rotherham in Britain or whatever, does leave them outside. They are outsiders. You can't really become British. You can't become root and soil French. So on the one hand, they have this outsider status that will never be cured. And on the other hand, the Mr. Consensus people that Ayaan Hirsi Ali talked about don't believe in multiculturalism, or believe that one does not visit one's moral codes on people from a different culture. They are allowed to bring their own culture and live and practice by their own rules, which is certainly true here about religious faith and all that, but is not true about social organization or how you live.
Right. Well, I think we have in the United States more resources to combat the problem, because, like Abe says, the structure of our polity, you have the First Amendment, you have the Second Amendment, you have a widespread civil society thanks to our tax code, which is often absent in Europe. You have, thanks to the election, a Department of Education that could hit colleges and universities hard with investigations and lawsuits for violating the safety of Jewish students on campus. There's a good article in the Free Press just the other day about a group of Columbia alumni. I'm a Columbia alum. But this group of Columbia alumni estimate that Columbia could be subject to 3 different Title VI investigations by the Trump Education Department in the next year, causing it untold losses because of the
$3.5 billion.
$3.5 billion.
They said federal money that goes to Columbia, right, directly to Columbia, $3.5 billion that could be cut off if those investigations find Columbia at fault.
Because of the atmosphere that the successive administrations at Columbia have allowed to take root at what was once a great university. So my hope is that before Donald Trump closes the Department of Education, which he is also promising to do, he just lets these investigations take place so we can enforce the law and the equal rights of Jewish students on campus. That's a tool we have that I don't think Europe has. Right?
It's the Department of Government Accountability.
The Doge.
Under Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, announced yesterday by Donald Trump. Well, one of the places you could find efficiencies would be to locate excessive spending on college campuses that are going to support these kinds of things, save billions of dollars, and start looking at that tax exemption that exists for the endowments of major universities that are interfering with the civil rights of Americans.
Part of the TCJA, the Trump tax cut in 2017, was a tax on endowments of certain size. And as part of the tax negotiations that are going to take place next year to renew the TCJA, I fully expect the endowment tax to go up because you have to get revenue from somewhere. Yeah. And I think all parts of the Republican Party have no interest in helping these universities, which have become dens of anti-Semitism, keep their endowments the size of, the GDP of small African nations.
Can I add that casus, I wouldn't say casus belli, but let's say reasons to adduce that you should do this, not only on grounds that aren't even particularly Department of Education grounds, but are the grounds in the tax code that involve tax exemption, came up just in the past week. Two very interesting things happened, one at Harvard and one at Tufts. At Harvard, the student head of the Institute of Politics, apparently there's some undergraduate who gets to be like the student president of the Institute of Politics, wrote a piece for the Harvard Crimson saying that no Republican should ever be allowed to study or be made a fellow at the Institute of Politics because of the threat to democracy posed by Trump. This piece was published. The key element of the tax code involving the nonprofit sector is that nonprofits like Commentary and others cannot lobby or advocate for specific political parties or candidates. That is the red line. That is when you stop being a nonprofit. Somebody said the quiet part out loud. We cannot allow Republicans to be here. Now, the head of the non-student head of the Institute of Politics, recognizing the neutron bomb that had just been set off in his little corner of Harvard Yard, issued a statement saying, no, we must speak to everybody. But what's there is there. What's been said cannot be unsaid. And at Tufts, after Seth Moulton, who was not a Republican, Democrat from Massachusetts, said, I don't believe that my teenage daughters should have to play sports against biological males who can injure them. The chairman of the political science department at Tufts sends a letter or issues a statement or something like that saying, we will not accept any applications for fellowship or anything from anyone who works for Seth Moulton. Whereupon another political science professor, Eitan Hirsch, issues a statement saying, no, that's not right. No, contact me, Seth Moulton, and I will work with you to let people from your office step on the Tufts campus. But these people live in such a bubble, in such a world in which they literally think that it's okay to suppress speech, and that they're now arguing that it is their right to suppress partisan participation in institutes at Harvard and to deny elected congressmen access to their campus. So
the universities have always been the most Europeanized,
fair enough,
zones in the United States, yeah. Right? And so it shows you what can happen if you don't hold them to account. And so I think that's where the real fight will be. And of course, too, we'll have a UN ambassador, Elise Stefanik, who will be highlighting these issues every day globally. Like I say, Israel is doing very well, I think, in the war against the Ring of Fire, the Iranian proxies. But this larger battle for the safety of world Jewry is where a lot of attention and resources need to be paid, and I think they'll be coming in the next few months.
But I think we do have to focus on the fact that we were treated to kind of our bizarrely happy place, which is the fact that there is a fight on the college campuses and that people are fighting back, to the globalized intifada that involves these random crimes on a daily basis all across America, the purpose of which is to unnerve and menace and harass Jews so that we will go underground, so that we will stop wearing our Magen David necklaces and our hostage necklaces, and men who wear kippot will.
This is actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this point, this is actually something that I think gets even in news media that's covering these stories capably, gets overlooked, which is the first order response from authorities in many of these countries, and even unfortunately on many college campuses and in local governments across the US, is not to say we will find the perpetrators and they will be punished to the full extent of the law. It's to tell Jews, here are all the ways you have to alter your appearance, your behavior, your routine, where you worship, how you worship, what your children can do in terms of coming to and from school, forcing this burden on the population that is being targeted for the harassment and the violence. And there's no other group that I can think of in American society in particular that is treated that way. That is horrific. And that is a form of discrimination that I think is worth, every time we see that said or done or even hinted at, that should be absolutely condemned for what it is.
Very important also, because we mentioned the Department of Education and the work that was done in the first term of the Trump administration to combat anti-Semitism, which did start in the Department of Education during Trump's first term. Now will be a question about the Department of Justice. We don't know who's going to be the Attorney General. We don't know who his sub-deputies will be. But in every single case here, you have, even though a lot of people are on the right are concerned about it, but it has been revoked and it's still there, hate crimes legislation and hate crimes regulations that mean that every single time a Jew is punched on the street, that can be raised to a federal offense, and the entire weight of the U.S. government can be brought to bear on every single incident.
And that's important because local prosecutors will not always prosecute these cases or see them as motivated by hate. Here in D.C., the only kosher restaurant on the eve of Kristallnacht was vandalized. And the local officials the next day said, well, we don't really know the motive. We can't really speak to motive. I mean, that dodge is in part why I'm very ambivalent about hate crimes legislation.
Actually. So am I. That's why I mentioned
we all are. But one of the reasons it's there is so that when a local progressive prosecutor says, nothing to see here, the feds can step in and actually, prosecute the crime.
And this is we're in a unique circumstance because I don't know, the absence of sort of moments in the United States, like the rise of the Klan after Birth of a Nation became such a cultural signpost in the late teens and 20s. I don't know of a circumstance in which you can say that that seems to be an organized effort that we don't really understand the tentacles of inside the United States because of free speech and because the government can't just sort of dip in and take a look and all. We don't understand what's going on here, but it beggars the imagination to say that these things are happening totally without some form of guidance or something, that they're happening every day.
Well, on the happening every day point, I want to point out there's a kind of a hierarchy of awareness about these incidents. After October 7th, politically liberal Jews were sort of shocked to see the response and the degree of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel animus in the country. And, I think we're all shocked to some degree, but politically conservative Jews had been saying sort of, there's a kind of I told you so moment about the left here, right? And then if you go deeper, my Orthodox and Hasidic friends say, we've been going through this for years. Years, well before October 7th, attacks in their communities with no response. It's part of the weather.
These knockout punches that, the knockout attacks that I think we started writing about in 2017 that caused the organization in Borough Park and other places of self-defense of communities, the Shomrim and others who walk around the neighborhood watching like a neighborhood watch to make sure either that these incidents don't happen, or if they're happening, that they are documented, which is part of what's different about what's happening now, is that we get to see them. I mean, it's horrifying to see them. I wish I didn't have to look at them, but better that they be documented, that they not be documented. And in fact, like the guy who grabbed the kid in Brooklyn, the guy who slapped the kid off the bike in Brooklyn was arrested because there was iPhone.
Right. There's and also there's security cameras. There was a time not that long ago in New York when security cameras were obviously just for show. Nobody thought otherwise, and they eventually had to kind of turn them on or fix them, in part because you had outbreaks of robberies and things that, and the storekeeper said, well, we got to get these things working. But for a while, you didn't expect to be able to look at the security cam footage in New York, especially in the outer boroughs, and find anything. And that has changed in part just because of the crime situation changed. And now what you're seeing is what Abe says, which is, you saw a video the other day for the first time, but, that was the 27th time it happened on this block since, 2016, whatever it is, they sort of have. And then the other problem is that you have it tends to be the case that the more observant, the more religious community they are, especially in New York, especially in Brooklyn, the less likely they probably are to trust the city government and the police force enough to make the complaints. So the other thing that you hear is, and you hear this with all minority groups and hate crimes and all stuff like that, but it is certainly true in this as well, which is that they are underreported as they are now. So even the ones you're seeing, which feels like, wow, we're seeing a lot more of this,
right?
But those always been
right. But there's a circumstantial time specific part of that, because take New York, and this then goes to what Christine's talking about with the prosecutors, or in other cities or other police forces in other cities. I don't think that would have been the case during the Giuliani era. I think there would have been an idea that the mayor and the police department, what they were looking for, they were looking actively to enforce the law, to find perpetrators and to punish them. And
that perp who grabbed that kid had been arrested 30 times already?
Times. Yeah. Since 2013, with the elevation of Bill de Blasio to the mayoralty, that has not been the case in New York. And the understanding is that is not what the mayor and the city government, the people who are elected, the city council, whatever, do not believe that the purpose of the police department is to either interfere with an atmosphere of crime and disrupt it and prevent crimes from happening by making it clear how serious the enforcement is going to be, or to bring the full force of the law down on somebody who nonetheless breaks the rules.
Well, and to defend the cops for a minute, I mean, this is true in a lot of cities. They're understaffed and demoralized after the Black Lives Matter summer. And when they do arrest these people, they arrest them, they read them their rights, cuff them, stuff them, process all the paperwork. They see them released the next day by a DA who will never, ever prosecute. And that is demoralizing as well.
That's right. And to Abe's point about the liberal Jews who have awakened, I had this weird moment yesterday. And this puts me in mind of speaking honestly about something, even though it's uncomfortable. So Sheryl Sandberg, of course, maybe the most famous female executive in America, number two at
lean in when you say that, John.
Sorry. Number two at Microsoft. Is it Microsoft? It is Microsoft, right? Sheryl Sandberg? No, Facebook.
Facebook. She's no longer there.
She made Facebook.
She's no longer there. But of course, she wrote Lean In. She wrote this, 5 million selling book, Lean In, and all of that. And Sheryl Sandberg was radicalized by October 7th, and she gave a speech to the General Assembly of the Federation.
In a good way. Radicalized in a good way.
Yes, in a good way. But that's my question. So her speech, which is very heartfelt and sort of like I didn't really understand before October 7th, and now I see and I understand. And I grew up in a reform home. I went to Jewish home. We kept kosher, but I wasn't. It just didn't seem to affect me or now I'm taking my kid to college. I'm worried about safety. How could this have happened? And now I'm awakened to it. I made this documentary about the sexual violence on October 7th, and things are just terrible. And for some weird reason, very earnest, She's now, obviously a force for good in making clear to the world what's going on. But I was angered when I read this very long piece of her speech in the Jerusalem Post, and I couldn't quite get it down. And I was thinking about what Abe said about politically conservative Jews and Orthodox Jews. You know when I started worrying about anti-Semitism in the United States? When Jesse Jackson ran for president. That was 40 years ago. That was Jesse Jackson's bid when he started talking about Hymietown, and he had the Fruit of Islam, the Nation of Islam, run by Louis Farrakhan, who said the Jews are the source of evil in the modern world, as his bodyguard and all of that. That's really when I started worrying that anti-Semitism could break out in a serious way. And you know what else? Then there were breakouts of anti-Semitic violence, including, the scenes in Crown Heights in 1991 and Al Sharpton and C. Vernon Mason and others leading, Freddie's Fashion Mart in 1994, which was set on fire and 7 people got killed because Al Sharpton talked about Jewish interlopers taking over businesses in Harlem, that kind of thing. So where was
subject,
Sheryl
by
Sandberg?
The way, of a very good Wall Street Journal opinion journal documentary.
Yes, made by Michael Pack, called "Find the Jew," or where's it? I
thought it was called the Crown Heights Pogrom or something like that. But maybe you're right. Find the Jew. I think
Find the Jew. I think anyway. Made by Michael Pack, partially the work of our friend Elliot Kaufman, and very, very worthy of being watched. But yeah, so where was Sheryl Sandberg? And you know where she was? She was implementing DEI things and, having meetings, I'm sure, at Facebook with some people who were coming to meetings honestly at Facebook to talk about Facebook policy, were celebrating the hang gliders of October 7th. Like, she was part of the problem. She wasn't just ignoring or not understanding the personal impact of this. She was part of the business leadership of the United States that led people to believe that these views were acceptable and that they were within the realm of the acceptable, and then hiring everybody from the colleges and departments that preached these gospels and all of that. So that's why I got angry. And maybe it's unfair because people come to realizations of things and it is unfair. But I did have this sort of gut, if you had been on this 15 years ago.
But this is really important. I'm sorry to interrupt, but actually
no,
your instinct, I think, isn't to punish, to criticize her specifically. I think what you're getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is really important because in the U.S., the whole racial reckoning that we had when people started looking around and the explosion of DEI stuff was very much, for lack of a better phrase, a black and white issue, right? It was like, we owe a debt to African Americans in this society that we haven't paid. We have to change all these things. We have to talk about race in new ways. But one of the core elements of that, and it came out, again, another little early signal, when feminist groups for the Women's March denied Jewish women who wanted to march in this feminist march, this protest of Donald Trump's first election, because they wanted to carry an Israel flag. And they said no. So there has always been this undercurrent of anti-Semitism in a lot of these left-leaning movements that we've not reckoned with.
Linda Sarsour,
exactly,
one of the organizers of the
huge anti-Semite,
is an anti-Semitic pro-Hamas
activist.
And her fellow organizers was eventually the Women's March sort of disintegrated over her fellow organizers' Farrakhan connections.
Yeah.
Specifically, Farrakhan again had come up,
right,
just as it did in the 3 decades ago that John was talking.
The same goes for Black Lives Matter, which was from its founding explicitly, it articulated anti-Israel, anti-Semitic ideas, policy proposals that the organizational thinking somehow connected to the police problem here.
And they expect Jews to be white. That's their whole message.
Well,
stop being Jewish, be white.
Yeah. Who was wheeled out the first day of the Democratic convention this year, but Jesse Jackson.
Yeah.
To see how, in many ways, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz party is the Jesse Jackson party.
Hey, who benefited?
Yeah.
Who got a little piece of the action from the Harris campaign?
Al Sharpton.
That's right.
And Al Sharpton. Yes.
And to go back, by the way, on the
John, you're not unfair. There's plenty of complicity to go around.
Yeah, okay. But also on the protest groups right away, we could start with Occupy Wall Street, because that had a huge anti-Semitic element. Yeah, that was the Jews are the bankers and Zionist bank of this controlling that was like classic anti-Semitism of the sort that you can't not notice. That was like Protocols of the Elders of Zion or Henry Ford style anti-Semitism at down in Zuccotti Park on film every single day for everyone to see, and that was over a decade ago.
So the root idea here, and again, this gets back to maybe why it was a big on Sheryl Sandberg. So the root idea is intersectionality, right? As laid out by Kimberly Crenshaw, law professor at UCLA, who basically said that all oppression is the same, that there is a connections to all forms of oppression of minorities except Jews. Apparently are not a minority, even though we make up 0.01% of the population of the planet Earth. But all forms of oppression are the same, and that the oppressors are the same. And so if you oppress a Palestinian, you're oppressing a black person. There's no difference between an oppressed Palestinian and an oppressed black person in Compton. And this is a worldwide problem of oppression at the hands of white supremacists. You think Sheryl Sandberg had Kimberly, or Sheryl Sandberg's company had Kimberly Crenshaw as a consultant? I bet you it did. I bet you that if it wasn't Kimberly Crenshaw, it was one of Kimberly Crenshaw's.
At the very least, she was invited to a Meta VR headset demonstration. They're always bringing people in to try on the headset. It's great, but I could see Kimberly Crenshaw, Michelle Alexander. They're walking in. They're getting the taste of the VR.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that it's not just that you weren't paying attention. It's that either by omission or commission, you were part of the world that allowed these ideas to germinate and to sprout and then fester and poison the atmosphere until such a time as the people who have been poisoned by it are, sorry if you're hearing this, someone's outside my window.
The streets of New York. The streets of street life. Yes. Lin-Manuel Miranda is going to write a song about what goes on outside your window during the commentary podcast.
Can I add one other thing to your point, John, which is, and it is a worse than that thing, actually. There is a kind of imprisonment of any thoughtful liberal, whether they're a white feminist or a Jewish, radical feminist. If they go against the underlying intersectional ideology, they are accused of being racist, and it's an accusation. It's as if you're not with all of us, you're against every single one of us, and so it's very difficult for them conceptually to point to the anti-Semitism. And this is why, to Seth's point, it took a long time for the Women's March to oust the people who were just blatantly anti-Semitic. And the Jewish feminists were like, what are you talking about? Look at their behavior. It was difficult for them to separate those strands because they will be completely cast out of the supposedly, groups of the best people. That's the problem.
So the surprise yesterday, out of nowhere, the appointment for Secretary of Defense goes to Pete Hegseth, 44 years old, Fox News host, author of 4 books, and a pretty outspoken person, I would say. Apparently the general line is, who the hell is this guy? I read in the Politico, everybody in the defense establishment saying, who the hell is this guy? Well, this is a very complicated story, and we're going to talk about it, but I would say one important element that is worth discussing is that of all the people who have written about the military in the last 10 or 15 years, he is unquestionably the best known because of Fox, because of the fact that his latest book, which is called I'm sorry, I've been reading it all night and I can't remember the title. The War on Warriors. #1 bestseller. So it's likely that in terms of writing about the military, this is the best-selling book since American Sniper. So he's not known to, somebody at Rand or somebody at Brookings, because of course they would never deign to turn on Fox and see Pete Hegseth. But he's very famous among people who actually care about the military in the United States and its composition and all of that. And so I'm not even going to defend the nomination in that, because we should talk about some of the issues with it. But the whole who the hell is this guy sounds pretty familiar, right? And I can tell you this, which is that what he is there's been all this talk we mentioned yesterday about Jacksonianism, and is it Trump's a Jacksonian? All that, is this foreign policy? Pete Hegseth is the Jacksonian, and I'll explain to you why in a little bit. But what did you guys make of the appointment of Pete Hegseth?
Yeah, a couple things. The Democrats have Mayor Pete. Now the Republicans have MAGA Pete. It's a contest of Petes. My views on Mayor Pete have been very clear. I have more positive views about MAGA Pete, say that. I think as surprising as this pick was, it is in line with other picks that Donald Trump has made in the week since he won the election. He's looking for loyalists, people he trusts, and he's looking for people who look the part and who are good on TV. And the portfolio of national security views that Pete Hegseth has discussed on Fox includes things that are very similar to what you might hear from a Mike Waltz or an Elise Stefanik or a potential Marco Rubio nominee at Secretary of State. You want to correct for the excesses of the woke military. That's his book, but are also pretty tough toward Iran, pretty clear-eyed about what the Chinese Communist Party is up to, and wants to have a fighting force that is more attuned to the concerns of the soldiers than, say, the general officers and the Pentagon bureaucracy. So as surprising as it was, I do think it kind of fits into the overall arc of what Trump has been proposing for his national security team. And just one other brief thought is any aspiring pundits or people interested in government service or want to build a career in journalism, you're going to want to try to be the weekend anchor on Fox and Friends. That is the position that Tucker Carlson had before his career rebirth, and now he's huge. And he was then replaced by Pete, who it could now well be the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. So that, boys and girls, that's what you want to be. Weekend anchor,
and it's only 2
Fox
days.
and Friends.
It's only a 2-day job.
2 days a week.
2 days a week.
You
lose your weekend, or you have to get up really. You have to
exactly.
Friday night.
But it's the long game. You're playing the long game.
Well, there's a mistake that people make about this TV stuff, which is to see the fact that Trump may have gotten to know this person or other on TV as an automatic negative because it means that they're just a TV person or something like that. I don't know Pete very well, and so I don't have quite a strong opinion on his being made Secretary of Defense. But I would say that I remember having a similar conversation when John Bolton was hired by Trump in the first administration, and all the major news organizations, CNN, MSNBC, everywhere, had all these stories up. Trump picks Fox News personality John Bolton. And I just remember thinking, Fox News personality John Bolton, like the guy who in the 80s was, with George H.W. Bush strong-arming countries behind the scenes at the UN not to recognize Palestine as a state, and all this other stuff. It's like for people's our entire life, some of us our entire lifetimes before John Bolton became a Fox News personality. And so Charles C.W. Coquette, our friend at National Review, said something I thought very smart, which was Pete Hegseth is on TV. So is Michael Strahan. But you don't think of Michael Strahan first and foremost as TV commentator. You still think of him as this, this great football player. And so there's a mistake that people make.
You do. I don't.
Right.
No,
but there is like this, he's on TV, therefore he must not be serious. But, generally people make it to TV, especially in the Strahan situation, because they, Tom Brady is on TV.
Right.
We wouldn't say like TV personality, Tom, right. So there's an element of this that you have to
Michael Strahan
be careful
gave
not to
Harris a tough interview.
So that's true.
That's right.
He's doing very well on TV.
People yelled at him for it. But I just want to talk about, so Hegseth, what's interesting here is that he's written a book about the decline in American education. He has now written a book about the politicization of the Pentagon. What's interesting about him is the tone of these books, because what he adduces or what he describes is not anything that would come as a surprise to people like us or to conservatives who do this, for a living at think tanks and otherwise. He is talking about problems where issues of readiness and that sort of thing are ignored in favor of more fashionable political matters. What matters is the tone, and that's why I say he is a Jacksonian. I'm just going to read a passage from The War on Warriors, which I have spent many hours reading since he was, I heard about it, the appointment last night.
You do the homework.
I do the homework. Okay. This book comes at a moment, and I write this without hyperbole, that we should be in panic mode, almost desperate, willing to do anything necessary to defeat the, quote, fundamental transformation of the American military and end the war on our warriors. In Battle for the American Mind, which was his book about education, based on the longevity and sheer power of the left's educational takeover, I argued for an educational insurgency, a tactical retreat from the educational system to regroup, save your kids, and build new faith-filled schools. The War on Warriors calls for the exact opposite. In this book, there is no time or room for an insurgency. We must wage a frontal assault, a swift counterattack in broad daylight. If we wait for nightfall, they will regroup. If we retreat from the system to rebuild, it's gone. And building another American military is not an option. We have only one Pentagon, one Secretary of Defense, one Army. If we lose it, we are toast. And then he goes on to say this: we will lose. The current woke victory is broad, but it is not deep. The shoehorning of diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, feminism, genderism, safetyism, climate worship, manufactured violent extremism, straight up weirdo shit, and a grab bag of social justice causes that infect today's fighting force have nothing to do with making our military more capable. They are anathema to everything the American military stands for. A natural antibody is poised to kick in. If we fight to unleash it, it will take stone-cold leadership, unbending courage, and unyielding fidelity to the Constitution. If we give the social justice wokesters time to dig into a trench, then the American military will cease to exist as a real fighting force, except against our own people. And this is one of the more measured passages.
Okay, can I posit something? Let me posit something, because I'm like, I will await to see whether this guy can even get confirmed. I mean, that his confirmability is
talk about that
still
too.
a question.
Yeah.
But
yes.
What's interesting about Trump choosing him, and to Seth's point about the TV thing, is that what bothers, I think, certainly the media elite, probably a fair amount of the Republican elite too, is that this guy talks like a soldier, which is awesome. He's very blunt. He talks like a soldier. He writes like a soldier. And that position, which is sec defense, is a political position in many ways. We are used to seeing not politicians in that role, but bureaucrats. There's something very bureaucratic about the way our secretaries of defense tend to both talk to the media and talk to Congress. And this guy threatens to really change the tone of that position itself if he's confirmed.
Well, look, I mean, we had defense secretaries like Don Rumsfeld and Bob Gates. And then since then, it's been a rocky road. And we've had two generals now, Mattis and Austin, both have big problems. And Mattis, 2 years in, left. We've not had a kind of strong Secretary of Defense for a while. Austin, of course, took leave, went AWOL in December without telling anybody about his surgery. Right. And it
he was basically off the job for 2 months.
So I agree with Christine. The condescension with which some people are greeting Pete Hegseth is remarkable. The guy went to Princeton and Harvard. He's written these books that are conservative books, right? Like you're saying, he's on TV.
Won 2 Bronze Stars. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a platoon.
He does so much work with veterans. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just know from my appearances on Fox, and I see him at work with veterans. This is a guy I think who's going to inspire a lot of young men to join.
And that is
he's
a big
the
issue.
face of the military.
This is where the rubber meets the road on confirmation. Because much of what the War on Warriors is about is that it's about a war on men. And he actually explicitly says white men. He talks about how the Biden, Mark Milley and Austin shut the government down for a day, shut the military down, a stand-down day, so that there could be everyone in the military, everywhere in the world, should get lectured to about critical race theory and white privilege and the danger of what is referred to as patriot extremism, a new threat adduced to the American military in the form of patriot extremism. Now, here's what's interesting about that, which is, of course, the military does not have a role domestically in the United States. It is under the Posse Comitatus Act of 1871. The U.S. military cannot operate inside the United States. So if there's a problem with patriot extremism, as is laid out, that is not the remit of the military. Maybe it's the remit of the FBI. Maybe it's the remit of every police department. The military is out defending the United States beyond our borders. That's what they do. And so this is beside the point. Milley goes before the House and talks about how he's really seen how it's really important to examine your own white privilege, thus implicitly saying that the hundreds of thousands of people under his command, if they are white, are themselves like him, holders of unconscious bias and need to have their consciousnesses raised. And he says, you want to destroy people's readiness? You want to destroy their feeling of connection to their country that they're willing to die for? This is the way you do it. And it's a war on men. And that's where the trouble is going to come. He opposes women in combat. There is at least one U.S. senator, a Republican senator, Joni Ernst, who was a veteran pilot. I don't know that she's going to like hearing that. I don't know that she can't then turn to her fellow female senators, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and say, I don't like this guy. And then you just need one more person in the Republican caucus to say, if you do this, we're going to vote against you, to have Trump withdraw the nomination, or to have say he's, for the second time, because he was up for Veterans Affairs at one point and they pulled the nomination before it actually could come to a vote, have him say, I'm not going to do this again. And thanks very much, Mr. President, because you just sold me 1 million more books and probably got me more money at Fox for not, for having had to withdraw my nomination.
Yeah, it's a possibility. I do think if it gets to a confirmation hearing, a lot of people are going to be watching that hearing, and you have kind of the Oliver North type hearing or the Pat Buchanan type hearing. A lot of people are going to pay attention and see how he performs. I expect he would perform pretty well. He might change some of these views. 53 senators gives this Trump administration more wiggle room in the cabinet selection. But you're right. If there's Republicans who want to make this about some of his ideas, or make this about kind of identity politics, then it might be in jeopardy. But I think as of now, a lot of Republicans are greeting this nomination by saying, oh, that's unusual. And then they start thinking about it and they're kind of starting to like it.
So I want to explain what I mean when I say that he is a Jacksonian. So in the context of American history, Jackson was the first person not from the American political intellectual aristocracy to become president of the United States. And the idea was that his ascension was greeted with horror by the Adams family and others, who had the genteel manners of the highly educated, knew 3 languages and, wrote beautifully and all of that. And Jackson was was a roughneck, who was famous for killing Indians and a tough guy and somebody who could not get it into his head what currency meant, that kind of thing, and came into the White House and, peed on the floor and whatever it was that was alleged to have happened with him. He was sort of thought of as an uncivilized barbarian who had somehow stormed the gates of our new Athens and had dirtied it, right? And so that's Trump, right? That's why people say that Trump is a sort of Jackson. He does not obey the rules, the laws that have been written, prior customs. Well, Hegseth's an interesting case because he sort of is a preacher like J.D. Vance of Princeton and Harvard, and then basically writes a book in which he has this sentence, and I'm getting dirty here. The unholy alliance of political ideologues and Pentagon pussies has left our warriors without real defenders in Washington. Now, I don't really like that such a person.
I know. You can't put the book down. That's what
I cannot. You know what I like?
It's a page turner for you.
It's porn. It's like honestly, it is. Abe is having this experience.
Oh, Abe loves him too. Abe, you've been silent so far.
All you have to do is listen to clips of him speak, and you're like, he's my id. This guy is speaking deep truths from well inside that I have suppressed in the name of civility and virtue and good taste.
You all seem to be anti Pete. I'm pro Pete.
No, I think Matt's reasonably pro Pete.
Don't put words in my mouth. You're the proest Pete of all, Abe. That's what you could say.
Go ahead.
I like the pick. I like it maybe in part because I'm uncertain of how far it'll go. So maybe I like it as a pick more than an eventuality. But at this point, when you have Lloyd Austin presiding over the Afghanistan debacle, disappearing without anyone noticing for weeks.
The balloon.
Letting a Chinese spy balloon fly over the entire country, knowing about it in advance. Sure. Yeah, maybe we don't need a bureaucrat. So
no, right.
Bring it on.
And by the way, the classic thing about a place like the Pentagon is it's not necessarily bureaucrat. I mean, it famously maybe the worst Secretary of Defense of all time in some ways was the ultimate bureaucrat. That was Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, and created the metric system for claiming that we were doing well in Vietnam, the metrics system, when we were not, that kind of thing, and bloodlessly talking about casualties as though they were water and that kind of thing. So there are bureaucrats, and then there are
Rumsfeld too was obsessed with minutia about office keeping.
There's the bureaucrats, and then there were the generals, and the generals are themselves bureaucrats. That's the thing. They play the game. They rise through the system. That's Colin Powell. That's Lloyd Austin. That's Mark Milley. Colin Powell never ended up as Secretary of Defense, but he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was National Security Advisor. And what these guys are is they are brilliant maneuverers within the Washington system. And that is, Trump wanted people like that at the beginning because he thought that they would, because he was speaking the language that he thought they liked, but he didn't understand that they already learned that their masters were somewhere else. And that's also one of the subjects of the War on Warriors, which is, whom do they serve? Are they the leaders of this group of people who live under a different set of rules and governed by a different set of priorities than Americans who are not in uniform? They do not have free speech rights in the same way. They do not have, there are all kinds of things they don't have, and there are all kinds of liberties they surrender to serve as a cohesive.
This is the basic insight from Robert Nisbet, the old conservative sociologist, which was that the paradox is that in order to have the survival of a liberal democracy, you cannot have a military that mirrors the liberal democracy. You can't have a liberal democratic military if you are to extend the life of a liberal democracy.
Right. And Hegseth, in my now favorite book, this is like, for me, I'm not finished yet, but it's sort of like, Barchester Towers by Trollope, Anna Karenina, and the War on Warriors.
This can be our recommends for the day.
It's already our recommends.
Because
it's already our recommends.
I've never seen you so excited about a book.
John, can I just one caveat, though, to your point about how they have to follow a different code of conduct when they're enlisted men and women. His personal life suggests once he was no longer in service.
Yeah, a lack of personal discipline. That is correct.
Very messy. I mean, no judgment. I'm just saying that's going to come up.
And we will be hearing about that. But he makes the point that the military is an organization that is dedicated to molding people, right? It is in fact a social justice organization. Question is how you mold them. Are you molding them into being warriors from whom you expect honor and courage and self-sacrifice, or are you molding them into being woke? And you can't do both, is what he says. Wokeism is the opposite of military and martial discipline. It is the opposite of what attracts people to the military, which is that they want a structure. They want to be tested. He tells a story about how somebody said to him in his first days as somebody in the military, like, you don't want to miss your war. And what did that mean? And he ended up fighting in Iraq, a war that he now opposes. But he said what it meant was the whole purpose of being in the military is to be tested, and ultimately to be tested in war. And you don't want to miss your war, because that's why, not that you want to fight in war, but that's where you learn, sort of like Calvinism. It's where you learn whether you have the grace that you are seeking, whether you are put in the position where you have to face these terrible threats and overcome them and be a hero, and that the Pentagon's priorities under Obama and under Biden were entirely the opposite. Because they're about fitting the military into a liberal civilian understanding of what it means to be a citizen and not to be the protector and guardian of everybody else. So it's deep, it's very vulgar, it's, as you can hear from my quotes and all that, and it is very unambiguous, let's say, so that there's so much in here that if the confirmation hearing gets hostile or tense, you just read aloud from the book if you're Elizabeth Warren.
Must see TV.
Absolute must see TV. Anyway, I don't think any of us expected. That's to say, he's done something that he might have done in 2016, 2017, which is that he picked somebody he likes on TV. But in 2016, 2017, he was picking people he liked on TV who I don't think were particularly formidable often.
And who he didn't know.
He
only knew from TV. He's gotten to know Hegseth very, very well over the last decade.
And is a cleverer choice, I think, is what I'm saying. And what Trump says he wants to, or we hear out of Mar-a-Lago, is he wants to fire woke generals. Now, maybe you could say he wants to do this because, he's trying to set up the military for his coup.
Well, that's what they're saying on MSNBC.
Right. But that's in here, by the way. There is a whole passage in here about how a lot of generals need to be fired because they are neglecting or they are turning their back on their core duty as people in the as leaders in the American military, which is to serve the soldiers. That's why they're there. They're not just to lead them. They're to serve. They are to provide them with the space to do what they need to do and to defend them and to defend who they are and what they do.
I just have had this, a moment of clarity recently where I think I spent a long time thinking of the Pentagon in the way that I thought of it 30 years ago when I was a kid, and in the age of Colin Powell, the Joint Chiefs, and General Schwarzkopf, and Dick Cheney as the Secretary of Defense. You look at the Pentagon and you say, this institution knows what it's doing. It is on task, right? It is lethal. It is leading America. And that's the leadership. Of course, the soldiers have not changed. I mean, the people who put their lives on the line are the best of us. But now you look at the Pentagon and you see it, and I just see another bureaucracy, right? That is failing the soldiers, failing the frontline troops, that actually expelled troops because they wouldn't take the COVID vaccination, right? And so it needs a revamp. You think about the billions and billions that go through that institution on what? Where we're seeing the future of warfare right now in Ukraine, in the Middle East, asymmetries. It's not about these huge multi-billion-dollar platforms. It's about who has the best drone and the best laser defense that can be affordable and effective. So I agree. I think we need a disruptor here.
I think that's, and we haven't even talked about like how great he is on Israel. So this is like, we're now beyond a trifecta into like, I don't even understand what's happening here. I mean, I've been told for years, and look, this was my great concern about Trump dating back to 2015, that his early support, there was that early support online that organized horrible anti-Semitic campaigns against Seth's wife, Bethany, against Ben Shapiro, me to a much lesser extent than the two of them. This kind of thing where you got this feeling that a rock had been turned over by Trump's ascension, and that he had these kind of troops that were like neo-Nazi shock troops. He wasn't responsible for them, if they just supported him, as he would say. But this was very unnerving. It really was. And we published stuff about it in 2016 about the intellectual dark web, as Barry Weiss and I'm calling them, who were anti-democratic and really were redolent of fascistic thinking, Mencius Moldbug and people, Bronze Age pervert. These are actual essayists, online essayists, and people like that, and it was very, very unnerving. And
it's like the old joke, the apocryphal story about the New York Times calling Meatloaf Mr. Loaf.
Yeah,
Mr. Pervert had this.
Exactly. Anyway, as my sister texted me yesterday, the joke going around Israel is that the Biden administration sought to sanction individual Israelis for their behavior on the West Bank. And the idea is now in the Trump administration, any Israeli who doesn't move to the West Bank is going to be sanctioned by the Trump administration, the way this is going.
And we haven't mentioned Huckabee, nominated for ambassador to Israel. Can't get much more pro-Israel than Mike Huckabee.
Again, more pregnant than that, not in the last couple of months, just like Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth said, we need to loosen the restraints on the Ukrainian military and let them use everything that is to hand to defeat Russia. So we now have two leading figures, National Security Advisor nominee and the Pentagon nominee, who are within earshot of the election. We're not with Tucker, and we're not with the MAGA foreign policy.
Has anyone done a wellness check on Tucker?
He's curled in a fetal position.
They're not happy.
Without a name. Yeah,
they're a little bit unnerved, I'd say, by a lot of these picks. But I think there's a lot of trust in Trump too. So I haven't checked on their reaction to Hegseth, but you
It
can see
sounds pretty
people.
ecstatic, I have to say.
Yeah,
Because of the
some
because
people are
he's a-
dredging up older video clips of him and everything. But of course, you could do the same thing for our next vice president, right? And that didn't really matter in the end for Trump. So, I would just look at it, and you look at these appointments, and we still I know we're running up against time here, but the apple that hasn't fallen from the tree is Secretary of State.
right.
We had the New York Times
Mark
report.
Caputo.
Yes, everybody seems to say that it's headed that way, and I don't know what it's about, whether it's MAGA stuff or whether it's Florida politics and who is going to replace him that's holding up the nomination of Rubio. But that's the one thing that we're still waiting for. If it is Rubio, this is a Jacksonian peace through strength national security team, not the kind of neo-isolationism that we've been talking about on the podcast for years. It's not going to be full-on war of all against all. Not far from it. That Trump doesn't want that. But it is definitely the idea that you need to be intimidating. You need to restore deterrence. And as the saying goes, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's the idea that motivates, I think, a lot of these figures being selected for key national security posts.
And from my conversations with people who are realists or further away from neoconservatism or whatever that, Rubio is the least objectionable of the first crop of picks. In other words, they're actually not that worried about having a Secretary of State who uses flowery language about democracy. I mean, it's very similar to the point, Matt, you made the other day, which was you put the idealist at state, you put the realist at the Pentagon, right? I mean, so actually there is a kind of fusionism here, whereas I've encountered a less resistance to Rubio specifically being at the Department of State and where some of these people are, that he might be striking a balance that is making everybody feel somewhat comfortable with the general direction.
Yeah, but the reason that they have that with Rubio is that Rubio has played a long game with them on the matters that he will not have anything to do with the Secretary of State, right? He has moved toward them on economics. He has moved toward them on trade. Although I guess the Secretary of State can play some role in trade, but he has become an economic nationalist when he was not one, and he has become somebody who believes in, using the government to help people, sort of family agenda and that sort of thing. And so he has inoculated himself a little bit without really changing very much on foreign policy, where he was easily the most neocon person to run for office since George W. Bush was.
As Secretary of State, he's not going to be doing anything with paid family leave. So it almost doesn't matter. Like the things they think about him almost don't matter.
That's where politics is interesting. Like he has done a lot for them in other guises. And similarly with Hegseth, one of the reasons that they are ecstatic about Hegseth, aside from his being on Fox and being Trumpy and all of that, is he's a culture warrior in a non-culture warrior, a place where you have to be people like us to understand that there's a culture war in the Pentagon. And they are worried about this. They've been worried about the transing of the military and the fact that, women and men serve together on nuclear submarines for 3 months. And
just the fact that
women end up pregnant and all of that.
The recruits can't meet basic physical standards. I mean, they're having a real recruitment problem. That should be very number one priority.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, it's an interesting, this is a much more interesting, aside from the fact that it's, they're unnerved and I'm nerved, right? And Abe is nerved. Like we are so nerved by what's
happening. The nerve of you people.
Interesting. Like I didn't expect it was going to be it was going to be this interesting.
There's going to be a hit. There's going to be some really negative stories to come out about him in the next few days.
Yeah, but
no,
yeah, I mean,
I don't know that he's gonna make it. If I think it's very hard for Trump not to get what he wants out of the Republican Senate. It would be very punishing if that were the case. But the women in combat thing, I think, is kind of which, by the way, I agree with. Nonetheless, I think is, could be a kind of killer app.
I think politics of confirmation may have changed, and because of 2024. And, Christine's absolutely right. There's going to be a lot of negative stories. But then what happens when Hegseth goes on Joe Rogan and talks for 3 hours about defense and his life? And, that has much more power, I think, now than a hit placed in the New York Times. That's what we saw in 2024. So one of the comments about women in combat comes from this podcast hosted by Sean Ryan, I think. And again, it's one of these long interviews. You just hear from the person. It's unmediated. Mm-hmm. That, I think, will help him if people are exposed to him in that way. And can he defend himself when he gets before the
and confirmation politics, by the way, have changed also because of Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah,
not just 2024 when we just saw
a turn.
Well, because
Brett Kavanaugh was
because somebody beat them and won. That's why. Like the
idea, and they threw everything, literally everything, at him. And then to some extent, Amy Coney Barrett was the nominee for the Supreme Court again to some extent because she had sort of triggered them when she had nominated to a lower court, and we had the whole fight about the Catholic thing and the organizations that she was a member of or whatever. Those two, I think, Trump just said we're just going to keep rolling, and they rolled and got what they wanted anyway. Well, and I think the politics have changed in the wake, especially of Cap.
So I think last point, and we have gone crazy long here, but when you say the politics of Congress, and you mention like he goes on Joe Rogan, so it has been for many, many decades the minhag, the custom, that a nominee is not to go on a public relations tour, that he's to go visit every senator and have a conversation and keep quiet until the confirmation hearing, not expose himself, not say things that might be used against him or that would get the senators angry because they're having private conversations about things and he can be more candid or whatever. That's like a real thing. That's out the window. We're in a new era. And what's more, Joe Rogan, 40 million people will listen to Pete Hegseth on Joe Rogan. He is also though he's left Fox News as of this morning, he is of course part of the Fox News family. And what are the two main facts here, right? Is that the podcast culture has become the populist political culture of our moment. That's number one. And number two, 75% of the cable TV news audience is a Fox audience. 75%. So MSNBC can scream and yell and try to transmit messages into the brains of Democratic senators. That won't matter at all. That will have no effect. The mainstream media will have no effect on this. This will all be a question inside the Republican caucus, maybe on Susan Collins, who has a tough race in 2026 in a state, although she did, she won her last election by 9 points, even though she was supposed to lose or be tied with her rival. But it's still a state that's gotten bluer and she's getting older and all of that. So maybe she would want to be heterodox, but she's only one person. And so, like if he campaigns, if Trump says, you go out there and you tell him, open a mouth and say what you need to say, it's a new, the old rules no longer apply. Confirmation rules don't apply.
I know you said it was the last point. I just want to add one last point, which is, I think this is another case, and this is something that holds true for the entire reality of Trump's reelection. Another case where the Biden administration's lurid failures and transgressions and chaos has made previously unthinkable much more thinkable. You after seeing the way that the Defense Department has conducted itself during this last administration, there is now, you could say, well, who knows?
Look, I just want to say one thing. I am so thrilled that the election is over and that I'm just thinking about how we spent 2 years, as I think I said, right before the election, in Sark's No Exit, having the same conversation about what might happen. while we were sitting in anticipation with nothing happening, in part because we had a senile candidate for president and we had Trump in a courtroom for 6 months and all of that. So we were sort of filling time with speculation. And the fact that we're actually able to talk about real things that are happening in real time that have real world consequences, and that there's news in the real sense of news, is a great liberation. So I want to thank America for its electoral choice, if only that it changed the topics that we get to talk about. Because if Harris had won, we would just be sort of talking about how they were rearranging the deck chairs on the Biden-Harris Titanic.
The ceasefire.
And the same, and the ceasefire.
Talking about the ceasefire.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's my gratitude. I'm not expressing gratitude for the election of Trump. I am expressing gratitude for the fact that the election of Trump means that we're getting to talk about other stuff, and thank God for that. So until tomorrow, for Abe, Seth, Christine, and Matt, I'm John.